Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. We're going broad today because world geopolitics and geography intersect with real estate investing. How is the United States positioned relative to the rest of the world? We'll also talk about world and U.S. monetary policy, interest rates, and inflation versus deflation, all with an astounding guest. It's How the World Works today on Get Rich Education. MC Lobsher is the host of the Cash Flow Ninja podcast and president of Producers Wealth. He is on a mission to help you achieve financial independence and freedom as soon as possible. He achieves this by integrating the infinite banking concept with real estate investments to increase your returns and recapture cash flow that you are not even aware of that you're losing. MC shares the number one strategy of investors in his holistic wealth creation course at yourownbankingsystem.com.
Learn the easiest way to create wealth and passive income with real estate. Now you can access the best deals without the stress or hassle of having to find, renovate, or manage those investment properties. Narada Real Estate saves you time by providing you with passive income investment properties in some of the best U.S. markets. Learn more at passiverealestateinvesting.com and download your free copy of the ultimate guide to passive real estate investing. There's no obligation and nothing to buy. Simply visit passiverealestateinvesting.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Well, what does the United States mean to the rest of the world today economically and geopolitically? And how does that trickle down to where you decide to invest in real estate? Yes, sometimes you've got to go broad. And today we're going to go about as broad as you can go, save for perhaps a show we did with futurist Stephen Kotler years ago, where we even stretch your mind and talked a bit about asteroid real estate. Then we're going to winnow things down next week as we look at geopolitics inside the U.S. borders. We're going outside today. Then finally, 2 weeks from now, we'll winnow down to your specific real estate investing strategy inside your own portfolio. You know, I talk to some people in the periphery of my circle that are very well educated and they're skilled speakers, where the majority of these types have seemed to enjoy spelling doom for the United States economy for the last 5 to 10 years, say. And the U.S. does have its set of problems, no doubt, and we'll discuss some of those today. But what about taking the, I'll call it, unpopular side and even saying, well, the U.S. economy is currently strong, and it's actually going to get a little stronger in coming years. Well, whether you believe that or you don't, it is a notion at least worth considering. And I know that today's guest tends to have a more optimistic outlook than most of these pervasive econo-bears do. What if the U.S. economy actually strengthens? It seems so unpopular to say that out loud, but you've got to at least consider that side. Are there any substantial threats to the United States dollar? Does any other world currency threaten to replace the dollar that's in your wallet right now? You're going to get a resoundingly clear answer today. Today's guest's knowledge of how the world works is really just flat out remarkable, and I think that his name is growing. If you're a longtime listener, like so many of you are, you'll remember when he was here with us back on the show twice in 2016. The remarkable Peter Zeihan joins us for the first of two back-to-back shows right now. Our world is an increasingly complex place full of risk and opportunity, and the ability to make sense of it and make confident decisions can determine control or disadvantage, foresight or miscalculation, and even the difference between your failure and your success. And unfortunately, today's overwhelming media environment makes it nearly impossible to distinguish news from opinion, truth from spin, what matters and what doesn't. But today's guest helps you make sense of the world unlike anyone I've ever met. He combines an expert understanding of demography, economics, energy, politics, technology, and security to help you prepare for an uncertain future. He provides a select group of clients with direct custom analytical products, and today those clients that he works with represent a vast array of sectors, including energy majors, financial institutions, business associations, agricultural interests, universities, and the U.S. military. He's a critically acclaimed author whose books, like The Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower, have been recommended by Mitt Romney, Fareed Zakaria, and Ian Bremmer. He's also a highly sought-after public speaker with a keen eye toward what will drive tomorrow's headlines. His irreverent approach transforms topics that are normally dense and heavy into accessible, relevant takeaways for all audiences. Welcome back to Get Rich Education. It's been a while, Peter Zeihan.
It's great to be back.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. And Peter, since you were last here, maybe 2.5 years ago, so much has changed in the world. Number one is the United States has a new president. But today we're talking about how the world works. That is such a gigantic topic, how the world works. But you're perhaps the only person I've ever met that can possibly tackle it. We want to view that through a lens of how world events affect United States real estate, especially, and nearly everything does. First of all, when it comes to other nations, the U.S. is in what I would think of as relative peacetime. What are your thoughts?
We are in the longest and greatest period of peace and prosperity in human history. The normal way the world has worked is a bit Hobbesian. You'd have locations with decent geographies where they could generate some capital and some food and some industry, and they would use that as a platform to expand their footprint into neighboring territories, or once you got to deep water navigation in the industrial era, to reach across the world to grab chunks of the world that hadn't modernized yet. And that's where you got the big globe-spanning empires of the 19th and early 20th centuries. With World War II, that entire system caught on fire and burned down, and the Americans tried something different. Instead of everybody having a separate system that was in a world of all against all, the Americans used their Navy, which was the only one to survive the war, to patrol the global sea lanes for everyone so that anyone could go out and expand economically and financially and culturally without having to actually shoot at anyone. We know this is the global order. We know this is global trade. We know this is an era of open markets. This is new. It didn't exist before 1945. And so we have seen countries as diverse as, in terms of imperial powers, as Germany and Japan, all of a sudden being thought of as Scandinavian socialists, and areas that had never really been able to integrate or grow like China could and became regional superpowers. But this is all new. This is all, more importantly, this is all artificial. And it's only going to last so long as the Americans remain involved in the global system.
To me, it seems more likely we are going to stay out of war just for reasons of corporate internationalization. For example, Apple, a United States company, now has a presence and factories in other places in the world, whether that be Germany or Vietnam or Morocco or wherever they are. So we all kind of have this connectivity that we didn't have before.
Right, but that is exactly the sort of outcome that comes from a globalized system. Without the United States providing global security, and sometimes that means shooting, you cannot have international manufacturing supply chains. For places in East Asia, roughly 100% of their manufacturing supply chains are dependent upon global maritime shipping. Keep in mind that the big players there, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and China, don't share a single land border. Everything goes on the water. And so if you can't have maritime commerce, you can't have that Apple supply chain. In Europe, it's a little bit better because they do have internal continental ways of moving things around, but you're still talking about well over 70%. In the United States, we're really not dependent at all. So you can actually have that sort of system within North America without necessarily needing to have a global security strategy. But everything about global finance and energy and agriculture and manufacturing today is dependent upon a global security regime. And the problem that the rest of the world has is that no one and no constellation of powers can substitute for what the Americans can do. And with the Americans politically losing interest, everyone economically has to find another way to operate.
Now, I've heard you say recently that the global order used to serve American interests, but that's not true anymore. Tell us about that.
The United States didn't come up with this just because it thought it would be fun. I mean, sure, we like to do things because they're different, but that wasn't the justification here. The Americans were in Western Europe and occupying Japan in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and they're looking across the horizon and they're really liking what they see. The United States had over 1 million men in Europe at the time. And we were looking down the barrels of the Soviets, who had just carried out the most horrific military advance in history, going through Central and Eastern Europe. And the Soviet war machine was terrifying. It was based on a complete ignoring, almost a celebration of high casualties. It was intimidating, it was armored, it was backed up by Air Force. It was not the sort of thing that the United States felt that it could stand against. So the Americans needed to convince dozens of other powers to stand with it. And if you were West German or Dutch or Korean or Chinese at the very end of World War II, you're looking at the Soviet Union, you're like, oh, I think I'd better cut a deal rather than face this down in war, because nobody thought they could stand. So what the United States did was basically bribe everybody. The entirety of the global order, the entirety of global trade, the entirety of the idea that the American market will be more open than anyone else's was designed to bribe everybody in to a pan-national alliance that could stand against, encircle, contain, and in time crush the Soviet Empire. We basically paid everybody to be on our side. And it worked. But then when November 1989 rolled around and the wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, the Americans had no idea what to do the next day. Now, we had a president at that time, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the right man for the job. He had a background in intelligence and economics. He had run the CIA. He had been an ambassador, vice president, obviously. And he had gone out of his way his entire career to be as politically non-involved as possible, to be bipartisan. And so he had great relationships with everyone on both sides of the American political aisle and with every world leader who mattered around the world, up to and including Mikhail Gorbachev and ultimately Boris Yeltsin. He was the right person in the right job with the right mindset in the right position at the right time. So, of course, us being Americans, we voted him out of office. And we never had a conversation in this country about what should happen in the world next. You remember the 1,000 points of light in the New World Order?
Right.
That was Bush Sr.'s attempt to get this country to have a conversation about what is next and what we do want out of the world and what we are willing to do to achieve it. But because that conversation never happened, we've now been through 3 entire presidential administrations under Clinton, W., and Obama that never bothered to have that conversation. And we've just been on strategic drift. We've maintained all the structures of the global order, but we've kind of forgotten about the fact that we used to get something for that. And without the Soviet Union being there focusing minds, there's a lot of question both in the United States and abroad as to why we're doing this in the first place. It used to be that the Americans maintained a position of strategic primacy in the wider world because that was necessary to contain and fight the Soviets. But since 1989, and especially since 1992, American primacy has been a goal in of itself. And that not only doesn't make sense, it's not sustainable. And we're now reaching a point where militarily, the United States is losing the capacity to impose its will at any point of the globe at any time. No primacy means no order. We've reached the point where economically the rest of the world has grown to a point that the United States can no longer afford the system. No American economic involvement, no order. And we've reached the point politically that the American left, the American right, and the American center thinks the United States should have a lower profile in global affairs. And no American involvement means no global order. So it doesn't matter how you slice this cat. This is over. And the question becomes, what does everybody do the day after the global order ends?
Well, part of the global order and how the United States fits into that is we have been the reserve currency of the world. The dollar holds extraordinary power. Many foreign nations still make transactions as what's denominated in United States dollars. And that intersects with inflationary policy and interest rate policy, not only in foreign central banks, but in U.S. central banks. So talk about the United States and the new role that we have in the global order and how that affects things like inflationary policy.
There's a couple chunks to that. I would say that the first chunk has to do with the reality of other currencies. One of the things that we all anticipated when the Europeans formed the euro 20 years ago was that there was going to be this new challenger to the US dollar. When the panda boom made China the second largest economy, everyone assumed that the Chinese, of course, were going to become another reserve currency. The truth has been something a lot more complicated and simple at the same time. The short version is there's no one else. The longer version is that if you are going to be the global currency, you have to, for the most part, not really care what the currency does on any given day. Now, the dollar is the perfect medium for this because the whole concept of the global order is we pay you all to be on our side. And the United States never bet its economy on its own geopolitical gambit. Remember, the global order was never about the money for the United States. It was about the guns, not the butter. And we paid everyone to be on our side. We are not a global trading nation. Based on how you're running the math, the United States tends to rank at the very bottom in terms of countries that trade with the rest of the world as a percentage of GDP. That means that whatever happens to the global currency on any given day, most Americans don't feel it.
You're saying we have a high degree of self-sufficiency relative to other nations.
Right. Based on whose numbers you're using, we are somewhere between 85 and 90% self-sufficient.
Yeah, that's astounding.
Germany, for comparison, is only about 40% self-sufficient. And even that belays the impact that any sort of interruption in financial flows or energy flows would have on their economy. Number one, the United States is really the only major economy that falls into that category. It's the only one that's big enough and insulated enough to not really care. Second, if you muck around in currency policy, you are a horrible store of value. So let's just kind of tick down the line. The Chinese economy is the most over-subsidized one in human history. Their financial system is basically based on massive throughput and subsidization. And if it was ever exposed to the global economy without barriers, the capital flight out of the Chinese system would be monumental. It is already in excess of $1 trillion a year, probably going to increase as these imbalances become more and more problematic. The Chinese know this. About 3 years ago, they tried to expose their system a little bit more to the wider world so that they could be more of a financial power. And they discovered that the capital flight was so extreme that they shut it down. So Chinese interaction financially with the rest of the world is actually less now than it was 2 years ago. And I don't expect that to increase really ever again. That's China. Europeans have confiscated insured bank deposits to pay for their bailout system. They started doing that about 7 years ago. As a result, the euro has basically withered on the vine as a international reserve currency. It's lower now than it was then. So that's them. Third country down is Japan. Now, the Japanese have a financial system roughly similar to the Chinese, not as extreme, and they haven't tried to internationalize the yen since the 1980s. That triggered exactly the sort of the capital flight system that the Chinese had in the 2010s. So the Japanese stopped it. They're not a competitor. Next one down is Britain. And even before this Brexit fun and games scared everybody away from the city, everybody in the world can really only agree on one thing. And that's the Brits should never be in charge of anything ever again. And so the pound is not a realistic option.
Yeah.
The next country down is Canada. You know, the Canadians run a pretty tight ship, but it's an economy that's 1/11th the size of the United States, and it could never be big enough to lubricate global trade. There's no competition, so you're stuck with the US dollar. Now, what that means in all of these other systems that for various reasons have their own instabilities is that monetary policy becomes a tool of holding the roof on, holding the walls together. The Chinese probably in any given month print 5 to 20 times the amount of currency that we do to force feed and subsidize their system. Europeans have never gotten away from 0% interest rates since they first got there back in, 2007? Because they know their bond markets and their banks cannot survive in a normal interest rate environment. The result of all of this is massive currency printing, massive debt, massive capital flight. And that manifests in the United States first and foremost in the bond market, primarily T-bills. Second, manifests in residential real estate, particularly in the gateway cities of Seattle, Santa Monica, San Francisco, Miami, and New York City. A primary reason why we've seen such huge, ridiculous, unsustainable property price appreciation in those cities is because you've got this foreign money coming in, fleeing systems where they fear it's going to be confiscated or they fear for the economic stability of their systems, and they want to get it into a place that has a base rule of law that they think is going to be stable over the decades to come. That's not Germany. That's not China. That's the United States.
Well, there's so much to touch on there. I think 10 or maybe even 5 years ago, people predicted that China's economy would be bigger than it is at this point now, but they've run into problems with slowing growth. We know they stopped their one-child policy, but the lag time with that long-time one-child policy that they had has helped to slow their growth. And there are so many other things to touch on there. But one commonality is that they're printing a ton of currency in China, and they're really doing that everywhere. So there is that tug toward inflation because everyone is debasing their currency. We don't have any currency in the world pegged to gold anymore. So there's really no check with balancing the amount of dollar printing with a certain amount of gold reserves anymore. And then on the other end, we have a deflationary tug of cheaper labor as we continue to outsource labor to other countries. So how do you see it playing out in the world order, and as far as that trickles down to the United States order, with inflationary tugs versus deflationary tugs on currency?
Well, something to keep in mind that money supply is something that needs to increase if you are in a system that is experiencing economic growth. So the U.S. money supply has increased from roughly 4.6 trillion. I know that sounds a lot. In 2000 to roughly triple that today. Now that sounds like a lot, but it hasn't happened in big bumps. It's been a pretty straight line. The Chinese system has gone from 1.4 trillion back in 2000 to something closer to 28 trillion. So they have gone on a level that is just almost unfathomable. And the total Chinese money supply is roughly double that of the American money supply, despite the fact that their currency is internationally traded. So that's what monetarily triggered inflation looks like. But if you've been following your numbers in both the United States and China, inflation really isn't an issue. And that's because the deflationary pulses that we're seeing have been far more powerful. In the United States, we know all about the retiring baby boomers and the financial crunch that that's going to bring us. That is real. We should worry about that. But because the American demography is relatively chimneyed, we don't have a lot more people in their 50s than their 40s than their 30s and their 20s and their 10s. It's almost straight down if you chart it out.
Right.
That means that demand in the United States is relatively tepid, historically speaking.
Immigration is helping save the U.S. demographically.
Immigration is certainly a net plus in that question. But if demand does not grow to match increases in supply, that oversupply tends to generate deflation rather than inflation. And that is something that the U.S. Federal Reserve is far more concerned about than inflation. So the Federal Reserve, if it was left to its own devices, it would really like interest rates right now to be around 5%. Because we are now a decade after the recovery, and they would really like to have some dry powder that they can use for the next recession.
Right.
It's not that one is imminent, but one is inevitable. And, the business cycle still exists. But look at everybody else. While the United States demography is more or less straight down, everybody else is inverted. So if you look at a country like Germany, for example, they now have more people in their 50s than in their 40s, and then in their 30s, than their 20s, than their teens. These are countries where productive capacity by those older workers is absolutely mammoth, but there are no young people to consume the production, and so they have to dump the excess on the international market. One of the problems with President Trump is that he's really right on some of the imbalances when it comes to trade. There are a lot of countries out there, Korea, Japan, China, Germany, the Netherlands, that have this inverted demography. And they are dumping massive deflationary pressures into the global system. Now, from a consumer point of view, this keeps inflation at bay. You can see the positives. But if you look at it over the longer term, with the Americans not reproducing to the degree that they used to, and the developing world completely unprepared to pick up the slack, you get a deflationary spiral of the sort that we have not seen since the Great Depression. And with much of the advanced world in the process of aging into mass retirement, and that's just like 3 to 5 years away, this is going to come a lot sooner than most people are expecting.
But ever since 1913 and the creation of the Federal Reserve, the long-term trend has been decidedly and emphatically inflationary. Don't know if you want to believe the farcical CPI, but that's often been between 2 and 3% per year for the last decade or something like that. Don't you think inflation will win out over deflation because it's just so easy to go ahead and print more dollars, or not necessarily?
Not in the traditional sense. You got to remember that one of the reasons the world has been inflationary isn't so much because of the adoption of the fiat currency policy, but it's because of the global order. We brought more and more people in more and more countries into a larger and larger whole. And those economies of scale generated first stability and then wealth on a scale that humans have never seen. And as we got to the modern economy where everyone's basically integrated and growing and safe, the demand increases from a steadily enlarging population becoming steadily richer were very real, and that generated the inflationary world we know. But that now is flipping. Global demography is inverting, taking away the demand growth, and global stability is about to fall apart, which will take away the sanctity of supply chains. That will lead us with a series of competing trends. On the one hand, you're going to have disinflation. Ongoing technological advancements, primarily in the United States, are making us more efficient. Now, disinflation is not necessarily a negative, but it does impact the headline inflation numbers. Another piece of it will be deflationary. All this overproduction we're seeing, primarily out of Europe and the East Asian Rim, when it gets dumped on the global market, oversupply, insufficient demand, that is the worst of all worlds from many points of view. And that's what triggers the sort of spirals we saw in the Great Depression. The third piece is inflationary, because when you break down the supply chains for the raw commodities inputs, things like oil, you provide inflationary spikes that can crash systems. Now, you lump this all together into a headline inflation number, and I'm using air quotes here for headline inflationary number, and who knows what it's going to look like. It's going to be starkly different for every country that you're looking at. I would guess that in the United States, it's going to be pretty close to zero. The United States is going to be a net exporter of fuels by the end of this year. The NAFTA system is relatively self-contained when it comes to manufacturing supply chains, and slow but steady population growth in North America should provide ongoing, if mild, increases in demand. That's more or less the world that we've become used to, just on a smaller scale. But if you look in the wider world, it looks nothing like that. Everywhere else, they're going to be talking about energy shocks and production disruption shocks and demographic shocks all happening more or less simultaneously. In some countries, that'll mean a deflationary death. In some countries, that will mean an inflationary death. And what it all has in common is no matter where you are on that circle, you're trying to get your money out. And there's only so many places you can send it. Most of them are in the United States.
We're talking with Peter Zeihan about how the world works, inflationary policy, interest rate policy, and geopolitics, and how that all relates to you as a real estate investor. More when we come back with Peter. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Finally, Total Control Financial gives you checkbook control of your 401k and IRA money to invest in real estate. It's time to get your retirement money into your own checking account, but you've got to avoid the little-known tax that you'll pay with any self-directed IRA. Instead, it's time for the QRP. Learn more and get your free copy of the QRP book by text messaging QRP in all capital letters to 72,000. For a real estate investor like you seeking an income property loan, go to Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. Over the years, you've heard President Chaley Ridge generously devote her time to you here on the show as a guest. Ridge provides investment property loans in most U.S. states, and you're going to find out how they've helped more people realize their dreams of real estate financial freedom than any other mortgage lender in the entire nation when you get started at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is Richard Duncan, publisher of Macro Watch. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Peter Zeihan about how the world works. You can book Peter as a speaker. He recently wowed an audience at the Land Investment Expo in Des Moines, Iowa. Learn more about him at Zeihan.com. That's Zeihan.com. Peter, let's talk about interest rate policy globally and how that trickles down and affects U.S. interest rate policy, including, is there a negative interest rate specter out there?
Negative interest rates are going to be part of the future, but I don't think they're going to be part of the American future.
Interesting.
You go for negative interest rates when demand is completely collapsed and you're trying to stimulate some sort of activity, whether it's at the consumer or industrial level. Even with the slowdown in the birth rate, Americans are still repopulating, even almost at the replacement level. You throw in immigration in the United States is broadly positive. So demand here is going to be sustainable and large enough to prevent the United States from needing to flirt with that sort of situation. But that's not the case really anywhere else. I mean, Japan has been in a functionally negative interest rate environment for 20 years already, and I don't expect that to go away. Their population, their birth rate peaked back in the 70s, and their population's been shrinking ever since. So you're looking at smaller and smaller levels of demand, greater and greater dependence on exports. Now they've found a way to kind of thread that needle. They just closed down the industrial plant and relocated into other countries. So they're not nearly as dependent upon supply chains as they used to be. In fact, they just kind of import the capital from their sales. So when you think about the Japanese in terms of industry today, most of their facilities that are producing things are in places like the United States, where they're right next to the consumer. That gives them a degree of insulation. That means they're not exposed to as much of the international chaos as, say, China. Now, I don't really pay attention to what the Chinese central bank says the interest rates are any day because it's a subsidized lending system. Their system has been in effect for negative interest rate loans ever since the opening began back in 1980. Now, it's easier to get that credit if you happen to be a state institution. And whenever the Chinese decide they want to try to fix this system, the economy starts to bottom out. People start to get agitated. They start to get together in large groups and go on long walks together. And then the Chinese just open the taps again, and whatever the official interest rate happens to be damned. This is a system that just floods itself with credit endlessly. Now, that is not technically a negative interest rate environment, but functionally it's the same thing. The Europeans, they try to run things a little bit more by the book. And so what their policy is tends to be what they say it is. Their negative interest rates are a very real probability. We've been at zero for a decade. The European economy is more indebted in terms of state debt now than it was then when the financial crisis broke. Their banking sector is far worse now than it was 10 years ago. And they're never going to get out of a zero interest rate environment. So experimenting with things below zero is something they're already doing on the margins. I would expect the European Central Bank to make that more official in the next couple of years, because there is going to be another global recession. There is certainly going to be a sixth European recession. Most people look at what's going on in Turkey and Germany and Britain right now and say that the recession is politically infused. And I'm not saying that's incorrect. I mean, Britain would obviously be in a better position if it wasn't for what's going on with Brexit. And Turkey would obviously be in a better position if not for Erdogan being a little crazy. But these are countries that have been risking an economic recession for some time. So the two, in my opinion, have really overlapped to cause their current problem. What's different this time around, two things. Number one, Europe never fully recovered from the 2007 recession. So writ large, the European economy is only a few percent larger than it was from the trough of the 2007 to 2009 breakdown. They've already had 5 European-wide recessions since then. So they're not starting from a great position. Second, because of the demographic situation, they are completely incapable of generating the demand that they need at home in order to trigger their own recovery. So they're starting with 0% interest rates. They're starting with no hope of additional demand, and they're starting from an economically enervated position. This is not simply how economic depressions begin. This is how you become inured to the fact that you will never have positive economic growth again. Just ask the Japanese. This is exactly the situation the Japanese found themselves back in the 1990s.
We're talking about global interest rate policy and forecasting that. And oftentimes, to stoke an economy, a nation might lower interest rates so much that they go negative. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's because imagine if you were a bank depositor and you were keeping your deposits at the bank in your city. You must pay the bank monthly for them to hold your deposits for you. You're not generating any interest. Those are negative interest rates, and that's the effect that has. And a nation might do that to stoke their economy because that way people won't leave their money parked as savings, and instead they'll get it out and invest it in a new business or invested in a piece of real estate. So just in general, that's why negative interest rates could potentially help stoke an economy. Well, Peter, just in kind of winding down here with how the world works, and yeah, I gave you a great assignment, right? Tell us about how the world works all in 35 minutes. But are there just any particular nations that you would want to focus on how the world works and how they're especially important economically as that might relate to the United States, whether that's Russia? It always intrigues me how Russia still seems to have a great influence on politics when they only have 145 million people. China and India, Japan, Middle East, Europe, Latin America. Any place in particular that might affect the U.S. economically?
Well, I think you can pretty much break everybody down into two categories. Those that can interface with the United States in a constructive manner that provides some growth opportunities for both sides, and those that are probably going to be imploding and providing those rivers of capital. Whether or not those rivers of capital will be metabolized in a useful manner is another issue, but they do have the effect of overall lowering American borrowing costs, which obviously is what folks in real estate care about. So let me kind of break those down. First, the positive. It's really hard to go wrong with Mexico. I'm not suggesting that everyone should roll into Mexico and do some FDI or portfolio investment, but Mexico is the only country in the world with a decent demography that already has privileged access to the American market, which means it's really the only one that has a guaranteed growth flight plan, if you will, for the next couple of decades. Now, profiting from that specifically can be a little tricky because the rule of law in Mexico is weak. Financial products are hard to come by. It's difficult to buy property. All those normal concerns apply, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be a success story. I'd also look very closely at the countries in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Indonesia in particular. These are places that are sufficiently isolated from some of the global trends that they're probably not going to fall into chaos like a lot of other countries. But they're young, they're dynamic, they're adapting technology, and you can throw in a relatively small amount of capital and get a pretty big bang for your buck. They're probably going to be some of the fastest growing economies in the future, and a little bit of a partnership with the United States would do all very, very well. On the flip side, the countries that are likely to suffer kind of the biggest breakdowns and generate the largest volumes of capital flight, you got to start with China. Chinese economy, everything that has succeeded about the Chinese economy is based upon American global guaranteeing of the order. And if you remove global trade and global energy markets from the equation, China goes back to being, to be perfectly blunt, a country that is on the verge of civil war. That has historically been China's norm, and we're about to get a lot more normal there, which means this world's second largest economy and one of the fastest growing economies of the last century is about to go away in the way that we think about it. It's likely to cease being a united power, and for every step of that degradation, there's going to be massive spasms of capital flight as locals are looking for places to store their cash or invest in projects that are more likely to not necessarily generate themselves a return, but are more likely to preserve their capital in any form. Keep in mind that a lot of this capital is scared and it's not sophisticated and it just wants to get out. And if they get half of their cash back 10 years from now, they consider that a win because it means they got something out at all. I'd also be paying a lot more attention to Europe right now. Now, part of that is part and parcel of Brexit. There is no version of Brexit that is going to be pleasant. Until we've got a final deal, money is going to be hemorrhaging out of London because it needs security and it doesn't know where to go. The United States is a good place for it to park until it figures that out. Now, there isn't going to be a Brexit deal that is friendly. The way European policymaking works is each individual country has veto power. There's never been a version of a Brexit divorce deal that could make it both through the British Parliament and through all 27 of the EU members. And you have to be unanimous for this to go, which means there's going to be a hard divorce, which means that London is going to not have any sort of arrangements with the European Union when it comes to financial transfer. The United Kingdom then has to turn to the United States, which is the only country of size and proximity that can possibly, even theoretically, replace the European Union as a trade partner. Well, that's going to come at a price. And so London as a financial district is over. It's all going to get redistributed with the lion's share going to New York City. That means the world's second largest financial hub is going to liquidate, and most of that money is going to come to New York.
That's astounding. I think a central theme here is that the United States has its set of problems, but nearly every other country in the world seems to have a bigger set of problems.
Much bigger.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, Peter, thanks for chatting about how the world works. There are very few people, if any other in the world that I've ever met, that could possibly take this on. How can our audience learn more about you?
You can subscribe to the newsletter at www.zeihan.com and watch that space because it'll tell you where I'm going to be and what media is going on. You can also follow me at Twitter, which is at PeterZeihan. I try to keep it simple.
Peter Zeihan, it's been great having you back on the show.
Pleasure.
Are there any substantial world threats to replace the US dollar? I think you've got a pretty resounding no today from Peter, and a lot of big picture perspective and monetary policy and the US's place in today's world order. I find it remarkable how you can ask Peter seemingly anything like nearly no one else I've ever known, and he is a speaker for hire. Like I mentioned, I know a real estate group that brought him in to speak recently as his name seems to be growing. Learn more about Peter Zeihan, again, that's Zeihan, by searching him on YouTube and seeing him speak, and connect with him at Zeihan.com. I'm grateful for your listenership, and I also want to point out that I'm personally really grateful that I also get to interview people each week like Peter Zeihan. Seemingly, you could ask him about the geography and economy of Asia's Mekong Delta to California's Sacramento River Valley to the Allegheny River Valley in Pennsylvania, and he'd have substantial answers for all of that, like he somehow was just in each one of those three places over the weekend somehow. Well, we played largely outside the U.S. borders today. Next week, Peter joins us again, and we're going to go inside the U.S. borders for a United States-centric show. Today is How the World Works. Next week will be How America Works, again with Peter. Then the following week, you're going to get a great big dose of me, and I'm going to get a little personal and start rooting around inside your own real estate investing portfolio. Yes, you and I getting more intimate in 2 weeks. There won't be any guest, and I think I'm going to make you see money in real estate investing 180 degrees from how you've ever seen it previously here in 2 weeks. Big thanks to our remarkable guest, Peter Zeihan, today. If you run an organization in any related field, consider that Peter Zeihan is a speaker for hire, and I am thrilled that you know about him. And hey, aren't you glad that you tuned in? Now you know how the world works. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
Countless investors get killed on their long-term maintenance costs in their rental property portfolio, but that's far less likely when you buy brand new construction. Let me tell you about my friends at JWB Real Estate Capital in Jacksonville, Florida. They pioneered the build-to-rent model that allows clients like you to invest in new construction, turnkey rental property. That's why JWB has been featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and other national media. If you want new construction rental properties in your portfolio, talk to JWB. Give them a call at 904-677-6777 or visit them at newconstructionturnkey.com. The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.